Spawner episode round number 2. Let's go. So 2 things. First, I'm trying to change the sound again a little bit. I hope this one I'm pinpointing something good. You can tell me. And also another thing, I'm actually adding those little emotes in the chapters. I think it makes it a little bit more readable. So you tell me what you think about it. Anyway, in this episode for the Godot C# Tower Defense series, we're going to talk about the spawner, and from the first recording of this episode, I can think that it would actually have fit in the previous episode, but yeah, it's a new one. So the point of a spawner here is going to be make something that will create a stream of enemies until it reaches a certain amount of something. So there are some very detailed videos on how to make spawners. Here my goal is actually to make the smallest one, which works the fastest without having a lot of too much luxury content, right? I just want a stream of enemies so that we can move on to the next feature. The way we're going to make this work, eventually you may want to try to do it based on the inputs I'm going to give you here. I'm going to create a new entity, understand a new node, which is going to be the spawner, and this spawner will have a timer which will tick and create an impulse which will create an enemy in the path 2D, exactly like we have the tower creating an impulse for the attack to be created. So I'm choosing to save this in a different file. Actually, you can create it in the world 2D and save it in a different file later. That works well. But here, let's just like create a new spawner 2D and save it right away in a spawner 2D folder. Okay, spawner 2D, great. And we will need a timer, that's sure, and we will need a script. There we go, spawner2d.cs. So really, this node doesn't need any kind of material aspect in the world. In fact, let's actually, okay, it could be a gray node, like a regular node, and I think I'm gonna do that. Wow, okay, that's actually a lot of refactors. I'm not gonna do that, but it can be a gray node. The only thing here, by having a node 2D, actually it's quite interesting. I want to say, not really a mistake, but usage of something we don't need. Basically what happens is that this node, instead of just being a blend node, it's going to have a lot of properties and methods which it doesn't need. So eventually this node will be slightly more expensive than if you have used a gray node instead. But for the sake of this tutorial, it's not going to break anything, just know that you could have used a gray node. Here, let's actually start to think about this script a little bit. So we will need to think about a few things, the methods necessary for this to work, and the export variables which we will need to link to this node so that it works, as well as eventually the settings which we will be able to edit in the editor. So let's start with the timer. The timer here, we're gonna be exporting a public timer, and we will set it a little bit later. This timer specifically, we will do 2 things. We will initialize it with a void initialize timer method, and we will also be watching what happens when the timer times out. So we're gonna have a public void on timer timeout. So when we want to initialize this timer, what we actually want to do is to know exactly what time we have to wait between the spawn of 2 enemies. So we need a spawn interval. For this, I'm going to create an export property, which is going to be a float, actually a public. And this is going to be the spawn interval. And I actually want to be able to edit this from the editor, even though eventually we might want to use resources, but here let's keep it simple and use the editor at this moment. Let's have a spawn interval of 0.75 seconds. It is also kind of wise, I guess, to always check that the timer you create is working like you want it to work, especially with those checkboxes. So I guess you can kind of bind those, like reassign those in your initialize timer method, just to be sure. I mean, that's not silly, but here Do you want it to be one shot? The answer is no. We want to be able to spawn multiple enemies. Do we want it to auto start? Could be yes, could be no. Here I'm going to say no. And could we, in the time scale, doesn't matter here. So when we want to initialize the timer, what we want to do is to change the wait time. The wait time, which is this value here, and we want it to be equal to this export value we have created. So timer.waitTime is going to be equal to the spawn interval. Once this is done, we're going to start the timer. In here, this is kind of like, we could use auto start, but if we have auto start, we actually start the timer before we set the wait time. That would be weird. So let's keep it here. Now we have to think about binding the signal. We can throw that in the initialize timer thing. Eventually, we may think for some reasons that some external entities could throw inputs to this timer that would, I don't know, restart the timer. So eventually we're not gonna bind the signal here, because when we bind the signal, we don't want this to happen multiple times. So I'm just going to bind the signal in the override ready function, just to make sure that this only happens once when the node's getting ready. So here the timer.timeout method is going to be added to the onTimerTimeout method. Timeout signal. Yikes. I'm saying weird things. Anyway. So here we basically have a timer that will tick every 0.75 seconds. Now, the next thing we want to do is to know what we are actually creating. So we need to know and basically call here a create enemy method. So we're going to create a new method, public void create enemy2D. And we're just going to do exactly that like the last time, right? We're going to access the path 2D to add a child, which is going to be an enemy, which means that we do need a path 2D, right? So we're gonna add a export public path 2D, and it can be the path. That's gonna be enough. In here, we can say that we want the path add child, and we're gonna add an enemy2D create enemy2D parenthesis and semicolon, right? So we now are able to create enemies. We can call this when the timer times out, create enemy2D. Perfect. Now, we have one last thing. How many enemies do we spawn? Do we want to spawn enemies forever? Probably not. So here, we're gonna create a new property, something like export public int, and spawn count, spawn amount, spawn quantity. Let's go with spawn quantity. And here, let's start with 5. Okay, so we're gonna have a base spawn of 5 enemies, maybe 10. 10 is fine. So just the quantity in and of itself is not enough to allow the spawner to know exactly how it's going on. Technically, it could, like, we could, you know, every time we create an enemy, we decrease this count by 1. That's a possibility. Another possibility is to have another property which is actually tracking the amount of enemies which have been spawned so far. So it's really up to you how you like to do things, and sometimes you may need to have another property for some specific side effects. I can't tell you how it's gonna work for your game, but here let's actually imagine that we have to. So we're gonna create a public integer which is going to be spawned enemies, and that's gonna be 0 by default. Actually, let's not initialize this, and let's initialize it when we start the timer. So here, spawn enemies equals 0. Right, so again, if we go back and for some reasons we restart the timer from somewhere else, we do reset the amount of enemies we have spawned. Something else you might want to do eventually when you reset a timer like this is to stop it. So here you might say that you want to stop the timer before you start it again, just, I don't know, what if it's still running and you are midway through spawning your enemies, then you just stop it, reset everything, and you're good to go again, like this. So we're progressing, but so far we do have the variable, we just don't use it. So two things. First, when we create an enemy, we just want to increment this. So plus equal 1, I don't like plus plus. Spawn enemy is plus equal 1. And then the other thing you actually need to do is to check when exactly do we stop spawning enemies. So you can make a check before spawning an enemy, you can make it after, it doesn't really matter. Let's say we do it after. So here, if spawned enemies is superior or equal to spawn quantity. When this happens, we want to do something, which is stopping the spawner. So let's assess. Well, we could say timer stop. So we can say timer stop like this, that's definitely enough. But otherwise, we could have something like, you know, create a method which is going to eventually do other things when the spawner is done spawning. We never know. You can add lines, and it's actually sometimes a little bit easier just to have a public void stop timer, and you know, you can add extra things in this method. So here timer stop is going to go here, and we're going to have stop timer. Okay, now this check is made after the enemy has been created. Now let's imagine that for some reasons you have the enemy created, I mean the spawn enemies which got increased by whatever, and you actually happen to create one more through this. So you can choose to make this check again. Spawn enemies is superior or equal to spawn quantity. You can do another check here, and here you want to eventually return, eventually stop the timer just to make sure that it is properly stopped. And you can think or say that this is not necessary, right? At this point, I'm kind of putting you in front of situations where you have to decide what makes more sense for you, because, you know, that's pretty much what programming is sometimes. Why am I so weird today? Anyway, the thing is that we actually should have enough material here to make this spawner work. So we just need to go back to Godot, build the project, save the little scene here. Okay, you're not gonna let me work. Save the scene, go to the world, and bring the spawner 2D. Okay, bringing the spawner. So we need to assign the timer, so this happens actually in the spawner scene. And here we need to assign the path, which happens in the world scene. Okay, saving this. Now it's kind of the truth revelation. We are in the scene, and we actually hope that the 10 enemies start running here, and it doesn't because I didn't initialize the timer in the ready function, did I? Yes. So here, once we have bound the timer signal, we actually initialize the timer, and we're done. So if you code that, well, good job. There you go. Happens. There we have the 10 enemies spawning one by one. I did a little change in the first recording of this episode, which is changing the ordering of this, you know, tooltip on top of the enemy. So I'm going to show you this real quick. In the Enemy2D, you can find the panel container here. And in the canvas item ordering, you can change the Z index, C index to something slightly higher, which means that it's going to display it in front of other things. Can be useful. But yeah, eventually we don't want the health and name to be this big, because it's definitely cluttering the view. So anyway, that's actually all we will be doing for this episode. I can come up with an exercise which would be quick and fast to make. Some interesting exercise, but it's going to require a lot of refactoring actually, is try to create different enemies with, I don't know, different movement speeds and different health values. That can be complicated because you have to edit the Enemy2D script. You have to make sure that when you create an Enemy2D, you can choose which one you are actually creating, either by using an argument or by using different methods. And then once you've done this, you can, create a spawner which works in two phases. One phase that will spawn a specific kind of enemy, and then once the first phase is done, you move to the second phase and you start spawning another kind of enemies. If you want to try this, I encourage you to try, because yes, researching, learning, always good. If you do it, please share that with me. I would be curious to see how you did that, because in this series, from now on, we will be moving to something different, because we have a lot of things I want to cover, like, for example, the tower animation, which I asked for in the previous poll, but also we kind of have to deal with two other things, which is actually buying and creating towers, and having a kind of health system. And for this, I'm giving you a little bit of a sneak peek. I'm gonna use the health mana system that comes from GemCraft, which means that the currency which you use to create turrets is the same currency that you use to soak damages when an enemy reaches the end of the path. Anyway, I hope you liked this episode. If you did, think about doing the usual things, liking, commenting. If you want to support me further and you really like what I do, you can drop a super chat. This is so appreciated, you have no idea, or even become a member. And as usual, the Discord's open if you want to share your progress with this series. If you have questions, we are always eager to help. So that's all I have to share with you. The light is abandoning me right now, and I will see you in the next video. You take care.